Well, hello, and welcome to What's Your Everest? That is created by my friend right here, Dr. Karla Steingraber. She's a sports psychologist and a mental game coach, and she's the founder of Everest Strong Coaching. I am your co host, Deanna Schoss, and What's Your Everest features conversations with professional athletes, trainers, coaches, and others about the mindset and the mental health side of being a competitive athlete. So today we are going to dig into the realities of what it actually takes to be a professional athlete. So Karla, who do we have joining us today to talk about this?
I'm actually really excited to welcome Dr. Jeff Fishbein. He's the sports psychologist for the Chicago White Sox. And in the past, he's worked with the Montreal Expos. And during his tenure with the Florida Marlins, they actually won a World Series. So he's got a lot of knowledge and insight into what it takes to be a professional athlete.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks so much, Karla. So, if you are watching live, we're delighted for you to be here. Please say hello and you can drop your questions into the comments. And of course, we're grateful to you for watching after the fact as well. So, now let's welcome Dr. Jeff Fishbein.
Hi guys, how are you?
Good. How are
Hi.
you? We're gonna give you top billing here. There
Thank
we
you.
go.
Thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to this.
Sure. It's interesting. I was wondering just this whole idea of having a sports psychologist. You've worked with several different teams, and I wasn't aware of that. So, is it common then for professional sports teams to actually have a sports psychologist as part of their team or their club? And what's your role doing that?
Yeah. So over the last, I would say, even 5 to 10 years, some sports have actually mandated mental health experts to be affiliated with the team.
Interesting.
A little bit different than sports psychology per se, but 25 years ago when I started, there were just a handful of people doing what I was doing for professional sport franchises. And now I would say virtually every team in every major sport has a consultant on staff or somehow affiliated with the team to perform mental skills training and sports psychology. And even, for example, in football, and it will soon be, I think, available in baseball and other sports, they're mandating just pure clinic, like mental health clinicians, because of the you know a
Interesting.
disproportionate amount of mental health issues that seem to be prevalent in professional sports right now. And we're seeing it, I mean, at the collegiate level, at the professional level. So even colleges now have sports psych on staff, if not clinical and sports psychologists, because it's beyond needed across the board. And we'll talk about like performance enhancement stuff, but there's a lot of clinical stuff that goes along with the work that we do. So though I'm hired to do performance work and mental skills training, it goes sometimes well beyond that.
Well, Jeff, I work with a lot of families who see their children as having pro potential, but there's just so much pressure, like you said, on these young children. And it seems to sometimes take the whole fun out of the game, and it becomes more of a job already early on and a job that they don't like anymore.
Right.
So, what's the mindset that's then really required? What's going to differentiate those kids who are going to be in it for the long haul and those who just won't be?
Well, I think, for those in the long haul, we'll call those maybe future collegiate athletes and professionals. First of all, we're talking about a very small minority of athletes in general. And the likelihood of, an individual who starts a sport and is able to maintain the level of effort, discipline, sacrifice, routine, commitment for 10 to 15 years is what it usually takes, is not very high. I mean, kids just tend not to be able to, generally speaking, persevere through all the ups and downs that is inherent in sports, youth sports especially. So, for the professional, I think the initial success is viewed as like the beginning, and for the young, amateur athlete who's 10, 12, 15, even younger, they set a goal, and sometimes that when that is achieved, that's the end of it, and then they'll move on to something else. But the professional realizes that it is a long, enduring process of major sacrifice. And I think we can probably categorize the collegiate and the professional in sort of one group, because even to get to the collegiate level, it takes more than most people realize.
Are they still having fun along the way?
No,
Mm.
no. I mean, it depends. It really does. I've had collegiate athletes tell me, during the course of their tenure at school, how miserable they are being an athlete, because particularly at the D1 level, the difficulties inherent in that whole process, being a student, being an athlete, the pressures that come along with like being what your coach at the D1 level wants you to be, because for that coach, it's his or her livelihood. And for the player, it may be a way to get into the school.
Mm.
It may also be their passion, but it is quite,
Mm.
I mean, it is a challenge beyond what most people realize. Yeah.
So
Beyond.
how do you advise? I'm thinking two things. One, I'm thinking of all the parents who are just positive that their child catches a ball and they're like, that's it, they're going to be pro. So, and it's such a small percentage. So I'm thinking, one, like, are there many more people who think they want to go pro and have the disappointment? So that's one part of the question when you're talking about the small percentage. But I'm also curious about the mental health and mindset side when there is so much pressure on athletes. How do you advise athletes to manage that? Like, what's going to get those that will survive for the long haul? What puts their mind to get them ahead of others?
First of all, the professional athlete is such a unique being that to even talk about them in the same context is like youth sports. I try to really separate
Mm.
completely, because at the youth level, these kids, it should be about having fun, being in the process, learning life skills, dealing with the failure that comes along with all sports at the youth level. And for the professional, whether it's inherent in them or trained, embedded in them by a parent or coach, failure is part of the process, and you get right back up. I mean,
Oh, interesting. So knowing how to fail, that's really interesting because I always think of professional athletes as that pressure to succeed and be good. But you're saying that part of the mental mindset is knowing how to fail, I guess, and learn from it and rebound quickly.
that's an enormous part of it. I gave a
Huh.
talk maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it was titled "How to Fail Correctly." Because
Hmm.
if you fail right, if you succeed in your failures, you will have more success as time goes on. But it's those who look at failure as sort of an enduring pattern of events that occur in, quote, my life as an athlete. That's why a lot of people give it up. I mean, just as an example, just to show you the level of commitment that's required,
Mhm.
I've been thinking about this last night when I had a client. She's a gymnast. Now, gymnasts are kind of rare breeds because what it requires to be able to perform all of the different skill sets, um, for being a gymnast, it's the willingness to kind of give up so much of your life to be something so great in one area. And there are a lot of kids that just are not willing to give up
Mhm.
virtually everything. I mean, it's the weekend plans, it's the friends after school. Gymnasts especially, you're talking about 4 hours a day after a 7, 8 hour school day. They get home at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, have a quick dinner, do their homework, and then repeat. That's a very difficult life, but there
Mm.
are some kids
Mhm.
committed to that.
Mm.
And we try to make sure that parents aren't like forcing that upon kids, because it's completely unreasonable unless you have a profoundly motivated child who inherently has something within them that's almost something you can't teach.
So obviously there's a certain kind of physical giftedness that the child has to get anywhere in their sport, but you differentiated the youth athlete from the professional athlete. What about college to professional? Because you used to be the sports psychology consultant for Northwestern, and you've seen people at various levels of their career and presumably transitioning from youth athlete to college to pro.
Right.
What have you seen in terms of the mindset from college to pro? Because there's a big difference there too. Very few of the collegiate athletes make it to the professional level.
Yeah, and not only that, but even like if you're drafted, just to use baseball as an example, but if you're drafted, if you're not in the first 2 or 3 rounds, the odds of you making it to the big leagues are well under 20%, if not 10%. And the further you are on that draft scale, 7th round, 10th round, 20th round, the odds are well under 5%. So it's an average of about 17% of people who are drafted in Major League Baseball make it to the big leagues. And that doesn't mean you play for 10 years, which is a lot of the goals of the professional. It means that you made it to the big leagues, and that might be for a day. So, but to differentiate, I mean, the first major differentiator is that, at least when I was working there, collegiate athletes are student athletes and professional athletes are employees or independent contractors, And so, and we see this right now with what is going on with baseball, and that, there's this lockout and the union is representing the players, but that is the huge difference. Okay, now from a mindset perspective, it depends on the person. I mean, you have some collegiate athletes who know that when their 4 or 5 years are up, they're finished and they're moving on, and they're using their experience in sports as a platform to, catapult them into the next area of their life. But there are some who absolutely unequivocally are playing college to get to the professional ranks. And so you see that kind of commitment in those athletes and the sacrifices in, the things that they do, what they eat, how they sleep, how they manage their time. Uh, and, I'll say this because I've seen it so often. Not every athlete wakes up and is excited to like go work out another day consecutively in a row.
Mhm.
And those people who have that feeling and yet still find a way to get their work in for that day, and that might be like a 2-hour lift after a 1 hour session in the morning with your trainer, and speed and agility training later that afternoon. Like, these athletes find a way to get it all done, and despite how they feel. And I think for the amateur athlete, especially the one who's not necessarily in playing in college, when they feel that way, it's like, I'm gonna just go lie down and
Right, I'm gonna blow it off today, but you can't
right.
if you're a professional athlete.
You
I find it interesting that you were saying that most teams now that it's mandated to have a sports psychologist on the team because of mental health issues. Do you
right.
think, I'm just wondering, that's very exciting, just the fact that there would be so much more awareness of mental health for everyone. Is it what changed in the industry that made I guess the industry itself realized that mental health was so important to professional sports?
Well, I I don't think a lot changed with the players, but I think the awareness that there are problems that these players experience is what brought this to a head. And so when more players become public about what they experience,
Mhm.
and you hear it almost daily about the struggles that so many, high school, collegiate, and professional athletes face, which is the best thing that's happening now in
Mhm.
sports, is that people are coming out and talking about it much more frequently than they ever have, because in the past it was taboo and it was like, you can't talk about that stuff. And it also followed the paradigm that, when you train, it's your body and your skill set. It's technique, it's tactical and mechanical and physical. and not mental. There was no mental training back in the day at all. And now it's, you know, I'll say almost on par, but it's certainly recognized as a valuable aspect, not just the performance aspect of it, but the clinical part of it too. And sadly, you hear these stories like the one that came out this morning from from Stanford, I believe it was, of a young girl who committed suicide. Um, Now, for probably a variety of reasons that we don't know about, and we're not going to speculate, but it's just a good example of the abundance of pressures that these kids face, and professional athletes aren't immune at all. In fact,
Mhm.
they may be even more vulnerable than others because of the spotlight that's on them, and the
Well,
whole
and they missed out on a childhood probably, which gives you a certain resilience, that you got to play or be frivolous or childish, whereas they've had to be really disciplined along the way and haven't had that freedom and flexibility. There's just a schedule that you had to adhere to all the time.
right. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, that's the one thing about these professionals too. They're so regimented, and probably for most of their lives, other people were doing most things for them. Either they
Yeah.
took care of the problem in high school when they were the best athlete in school, or people look the other way, and then you get to the big leagues or your professional sports, and literally you have an itinerary that's laid out for you on the board when you leave the stadium at night, and you know when to show up, what's going to go on for each minute of each hour. And that's the way these guys function, and they become habits, of uh, of behavior that put them in a position to be the best that they can be. And
How
so,
much do you think along those lines? I'm thinking with that regimentation and just used to things working a certain way, and now all of a sudden fans couldn't be in the stadium, or then games are being played or they're not, and social distancing. And I'm wondering, how much does the excitement of fan support play into it? And what was that like for players when all of a sudden the stadiums were empty, but they still had to perform at that really optimal level?
that's such a good question, because when COVID hit and fans weren't allowed in, a lot of players struggled to figure out the right arousal level to
Yeah.
perform under,
Yeah.
because when you have no fans, there's less adrenaline that's caused naturally by the experience of being in a stadium with 30 or 40,000 fans, or even 10,000 fans, so you go from that to you're playing in your backyard basically with some friends. And
Yeah.
then it's like, how do you uh, get to that zone of optimal functioning, which I recall talking to many players about the difference of playing in that sort of environment versus the one that they've been used to forever. So that did present a challenge, but I think on a sort of larger scale, professional athletes do a pretty good job at adjusting to most anything that does occur. They're sort of used to it, whether it's rain delays or someone gets injured, or whatever. Even the thing that's going on right now, there are athletes who are having to adjust. Athletes, let's just say in baseball, they're prepared to be at a certain level of preparation for the beginning of spring training.
Mhm.
Now, spring training seems to be delayed, let's say, for a period of time. Now the question is, well, what do I do? Like, should I keep ramping up? Should I pull back? Um,
Mhm.
and so it's an adjustment. They're really good at making both out of game and in game adjustments. And that's one thing that professional athletes do when they're struggling in a sport during the course of a competition. They have to make adjustments, and they're better at it than most other people
Mm.
doing what they do, because
Well,
they're forced to.
mhm. What I'm even thinking, because I know Karla is a mental game coach.
Mhm.
Like, is there, do you give them a process like, here, when this happens, do these three things in your mind? And maybe Karla first, but both of you, there must be skills that you have to learn. That doesn't always come naturally. or does it?
Well, certainly some people are more flexible or more able to shift and do that, but other people, yeah, there are specific skills that you teach, and everybody's got different ones that work better for them. Some people do, it depends, of course, like do they get too relaxed or do they get too anxious? So are you doing something to get them to ramp up or make themselves ramp up, get to the right arousal level, or are you doing something for them to calm down and relax a little bit?
Mm. So,
Yeah, and I think that just generally speaking, um, these athletes like routines.
mhm,
And so no matter what's really going on, whether it's a situation in a game, or it's a, like a quote unquote high pressured event that's in front of them, their routine is so important because they're able to fall back to and lose themselves in that routine, which
mhm,
tends to familiarize the individual and create some level of comfort in a theoretically uncomfortable situation, right?
mhm,
So they rely on that which they've trained and stick with that. That's something they control
mhm.
versus
Well,
what's going on the outside when they can't.
sure. Although here's a question. Thank you so much for joining us. What were I'm just thinking of that routine. Now the routine changed. There's no stimulation from fans. So they were asking what are some of the solutions tried to offset the absence of stimulation from fans? Because I guess that was something new that needed to
Yeah.
be addressed. And thanks for joining
So
us.
as it turns out, and it was kind of an interesting observation by one of the players, was he felt he needed to create more adrenaline because of the lack of fans, and what he
Mhm.
ended up doing was creating too much,
Oh,
and so there was
interesting.
too much tension because the game itself, and the level of competition and the ability to win a game, which is still their goal in professional sports,
Mhm.
that produces generally enough of arousal and adrenaline for them to perform at their optimal level. Um, in other sports, like golf, as an example, they had no fans too,
Mhm.
but there's not as great of an impact on them because usually it's very quiet and serene,
Mhm.
and
Sure.
Not at your golf games,
Mm,
Jeff.
it's harder to play a game when there's complete
that's
silence,
funny.
believe it or not, than
Mhm.
when there's a lot of chaos
Mhm.
distracting you
Sure.
from your own thoughts.
Did
Yeah.
baseball do the same thing that soccer did? I found it fascinating that soccer recorded, like when those two specific teams had played, they did recordings and then actually put in sound. But I don't know if the players could hear that sound, but certainly people watching on TV actually had, because people watching didn't like the silence.
Right.
Yeah, I don't recall, but
Mm,
part of me vaguely remembers hearing, um, some sounds, particularly at golf tournaments, like with birds chirping and, a
oh,
little bit of that. I mean, look, some of this is about fans, but at the end of the day, the players are really about their experience on the field and
mm,
getting themselves as ready to be as good as they can be on that given day. And so whether there's fans or not, whether there's, any situation that might be viewed as an obstacle for them, it's really about I have to get present, I have to
mm,
execute, I know how to do that, I stick with what I know, and boom,
mm.
and then they go.
That's really interesting just from someone who watches sports where you sometimes wonder because people are shouting, there's hecklers, they're this or that. That must be part of the process, either Karla as a mental game coach or Jeff, when
Mhm.
you're working with players on how that's so interesting. It's the balance between they're probably trained to shut out the ambient noise, and yet when it's not there, then how do you compensate for it? That's an interesting paradigm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think they do a good job. Sorry, real quick though, I think they do a good job at training themselves to be locked in and not even attend to the noise that exists, like literal or figurative, um, because that is really ambient. That is background. That is sort of just par for the course.
Mhm,
Okay, so when they stick with the routines and lock in on what they have to do, whether it's a hitter or pitcher or golfer or whatever, tennis player, like generally they're not bothered by what we hear in the stands of fans yelling
mhm,
silly things or other things going on that we would view as a distraction. They don't generally view it as that. And you'll notice, because you don't see players like look in the stands at who said that. It's just like little bits of noise to them that is almost irrelevant.
Well, they've had years of practice too. I mean, certainly when you work with high school athletes, you'll sometimes hear them talk about how upsetting it was that there was some parent yelling something, and you'll just see how much that interferes with the way they feel about the game or the next game or that game. But certainly the ones who have gone pro have been dealing with that for years.
Mm-hmm. So if someone is thinking, just going straight from that, Karla, if someone is thinking of going professional, maybe they have the skill, they're the star of their team, what advice do you have for someone who's thinking that they're on a trajectory to become a pro athlete?
Have a plan B.
Yeah, I was wondering, because that is a question. People who think that's the only thing they're going to do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You always have to have a plan B. And I think it was Arnold Schwarzenegger who already was planning his career post his Mr. Olympia and all the rest. He was already thinking about becoming a movie star. And while he was a movie star, he was already thinking about becoming a politician. And always having your next plan in place is important, because any day could be a career-ending injury. Something could happen. And so what are you going to do next? You have multiple skills or things that are meaningful to you that you can do. And you see, even when some professional athletes retire, some go into a whole new career, whether it's they produce films or something like that, and others don't know where to go. And they really struggle with it.
Yeah, I totally agree, actually. It's just really, really difficult. You're talking about a very, very, very small minority. I mean, under 0.001%, I mean, just a tiny, tiny cluster of people find their way to the top of that landscape. So, yeah, you have to find a little balance, and sometimes that's really important because it doesn't work out. So I'm not sure that really excites people and motivates people to try to do that. But I don't even think that should be the goal. It's like, can I just be the best that I can be each day? And if that leads me towards something and I start getting the attention, great. And then you'll stay, let it happen sort of organically. You can always have the dream and the goal, but everyone has a dream and the goal when they're 5 years old. At some point, reality hits, and then it's like, what do I do with that?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of dreams and we were like so in sync on that.
I was going to say, speaking of dreams and goals, Jeff, I know you had to give up on your professional golf career and you pursued sports psychology. But what about now? What's your Everest? What's next for you?
Well, just to make sure the audience realizes I was never a professional golfer and that you're just messing around with me. But I do love golf and I'm passionate about it. And I'm passionate about the field that we're in. And when I hear stories like what happened this morning, and we've all experienced, athletes and others who have struggled and, experienced depression or anxiety or worse, it makes you think, like, what else can we do? Because, like, we are one person and there are thousands of people out there for professionals like Karla and myself to see. So one of the things actually that we're working on is I'm part of a company called Clutch. It's we're developing an application for youth athletes to train mental fitness. And most of the apps that are out there right now, like Headspace and Calm and others, they're all about meditation, which is fantastic, and mental health, which is needed for sure. But to have like your personal mental fitness coach, that's what we're trying to establish. And we have created, our prototype. We're in beta testing. It's actually quite exciting, and we're hoping that it takes off, because access to people like us is not easy. And it's not that we're so important, but what we are is we have a specialty in which there is a need, across the country and beyond, and only a handful of people can get their hands on, that resource. So creating an app like this that's engaging, that's AI, that maybe goes into virtual reality, these things are critical so that anyone and everyone can get their hands on mental fitness training to become sort of hardier and more fit to deal with all of the stresses that come with being a youth athlete. That's our goal, and we're pretty confident it's going to go somewhere.
Awesome.
That
Yeah.
is really great. Well,
Thanks.
thank you so much for being here. So you can actually, speaking of getting access to, you can find Karla at Everstrong Coaching. You can find Jeff at drfishbein.com, or it sounds like coming soon. I guess will it be clutchapp.com or clutch.com coming fairly soon. So
Yes, we'll make sure that you all hear about it once it's live.
fantastic. We'll make sure we get the
Thank you.
word out about that. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to What's Your Everest. Karla, who do we have joining us next week?
We've got Robert Jones Black, the great grandson of Bobby Jones, one of the greatest amateur golfers of all time. And he's going to be joined by two collegiate golfers, one from my alma mater, Duke University. So it's very exciting.
That's great.
Good. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone who joined us live. We'll make sure that when the new apps and things are out, that those will be in the comments so that people can find that. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. And thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Karla, both for a great show.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.